week, I talked to you about a concept called homeschool lasagna, which is the practice of layering in the beginning of your homeschool year. So this week, I want to talk to you about another layer that would be helpful specifically to those of you who have high school students, in particular 11th and 12th graders. Before I go into that, though, I want to tell you a story about when we were new to homeschooling. I was still under the delusion that I could somehow be super mom and super teacher and super wife all at the same time. And so I was trying to do a lot of home scratch cooking because in my mind I thought that would make me somehow a better mom. Like I said, it was delusion, not reality. But my kids, I would notice when I would grab something on a hurried night and not make something from scratch, for instance, spaghetti sauce, and I just poured it out of a jar, my children would gobble it up without complaint. But on the nights when I tried to make spaghetti sauce homemade with everything from scratch, they sort of turned their nose up at it a little bit. They didn't devour it as much as they did when it was the hurried, quick recipe. And they still ate it. I mean, what was the other option? Starve, and they didn't want to do that. But I sort of started to notice the difference. So I started checking my homemade ingredients against the jarred ingredients, and I found that in the jarred ingredients, there was sugar. Well, who's not going to want sugar over no sugar, right? So the ready-made spaghetti sauce was sweet because it had the added ingredient of sugar. So today I want to talk to you about a secret added ingredient to your high school homeschooling experience that might make for a more successful outcome at the end, where your children find an option that is more palatable for them, maybe not just their learning style, but also, considering we're in this pandemic, for convenience and safety purposes. I would like to talk to you about the classic learning test, and it is a alternative to the ACT and the SAT test. It's not as well known. It became available in 2016 and it continues on today. So that's only 5 years under its belt in comparison to the ACT or the SAT, which have over 50 years of being out and about for people. So a quick compare and contrast, the SAT and the ACT are core, and which appeals to the public school system. That's how the public school system is set up, and so those students are very familiar with the information being tested on the ACT and the SAT, whereas the CLT, the classic learning test, is set up not aligned to Common Core, but it's set up to reflect a classic learning education. So you think about things like Charlotte Mason and the way our founding fathers of this nation learned. You know, you think about the little schoolhouse with multiple levels of ages and curriculum being taught. That is how the classic learning test is set up. The ACT and the SAT range anywhere between 3 and 4 hours with an optional essay, whereas the CLT is a maximum of 2 hours with an optional essay. The ACT and the SAT, they test math and evidence-based reading, science. The CLT measures verbal reasoning, grammar writing, and quantitative reasoning. So you think about the way that most homeschooling families set up their schools. It aligns far more with this classic learning education than with an institutionalized education that you would find in the public school system. The ACT and the SAT do not have remote access options, whereas the CLT does. And considering the times of our culture right now with the pandemic that we're living in, there's been a whole slew of graduating students who have had to apply to college test optional, meaning they did not have the opportunity or did not feel comfortable going to a testing site to take the ACT or the SAT. With the CLT, you have the option of doing it from the comfort and convenience of your home and still having it be proctored remotely. Also, with the CLT, there is time in between each section to move and wiggle, which appeals to a lot of learners. One of my children who has taken the CLT, that was a huge game changer for him, just having the opportunity to move. Let's see. You also get your test scores within 24 hours if you're doing an in-person testing site, which you can do through a testing center or a partnering school. Many of our local private schools offer the CLT test. If you're doing it remotely, completely proctored at home, it could take 2 weeks to get your results. But 2 weeks is still faster than the results that you would get from your ACT or SAT. There is no formal science section of the CLT. However, there might be writing sections that include science where you're answering questions based off of reading comprehension or something like that. The scoring for the CLT is 120. Whereas with the ACT or the SAT, the maximum perfect score would be 1600. The ACT is 36 for a perfect score. A perfect score on the CLT is actually 120, but in order to be, if you wanted to compare it to an ACT or an SAT, a 114 on the CLT would be considered equivalent to a perfect ACT or SAT score. The cost of the CLT is much more affordable than the ACT. The cost for the CLT is $54, whereas the cost for an ACT or an SAT ranges anywhere between $55 to $85. So the CLT is a more cost-effective choice. Homeschooling families, in the studies that they've done over the last 5 years for the CLT, homeschooling students exceed far and beyond the public school student who takes the CLT. And the reason for that is because the public school student, their education has been aligned and based on Common Core, whereas most homeschooling families, their education has been set up very literature-based, very classic style, the way that they learn through conversation, rather than just multiple choice, check the correct box, memorize this for a test. Whereas the ACT and the SAT check for recall of specific information, the CLT takes a more comprehensive measure of a student's overall knowledge. There are 12 offerings per year for the CLT exam, with the next one being offered in mid-September. And the way that they group their test offerings is, for instance, the next option to be able to take it is September 14th through the 16th. And I believe registration closes on September 9th. So if you register to take it in mid-September, you have the choice to choose between September 14th, September 15th, or September 16th. Just as with the ACT and the SAT, the CLT does offer practice materials that you can use. You can go to their website, which is www.cltexam.com. You can find different universities that accept the CLT. Because it's not as widely known and doesn't have the same history yet that the ACT and the SAT have, not as many colleges and universities accept it. However, over 204 universities throughout our nation do accept it. Some of those, most of which are liberal arts universities, most are private universities and colleges. But just some examples are Abilene Christian University, Dallas Baptist University, Colorado Christian University, Howard Payne, the University of Dallas, the University of Baylor, and Bob Jones University. If you want to know if your college that you're interested in accepts the CLT as an option, you can go directly to that university's admissions webpage and see what their requirements are. And if they list CLT, then you know that they do allow the CLT for admission. Another thing to consider about the CLT, especially given right now with so many unknowns, our testing center is going to close down again and make it difficult for these graduating seniors to have an opportunity to be able to take a college entrance exam, is the remote option. I know I mentioned that a few minutes ago, but I do want to mention that a lot of universities, because of the COVID pandemic, are allowing admissions under what's called test optional. And what that means is you can still be looked at and considered for academic merit scholarships upon admission. However, They'll base that decision on your GPA and class ranking without a test score, which almost always disqualifies you for whatever that university's top academic scholarship is. A lot of universities refer to that as their presidential scholarship. Having the option to be able to take a college entrance exam remotely removes that hindrance of not having the same opportunity to qualify for merit scholarships because you didn't have an opportunity to take a test. So that's another, I guess, appealing or bonus of this particular test. You don't have to go to a testing site. So it could be that for your homeschooling high school last year or two, this exam is your secret sugar hiding in your recipe. It might be the ingredient in the option that opens the door for your student, for your family, to be able to take a college entrance exam and have a higher success rate than they would on the traditional ACT, SAT. So, until next time, happy homeschooling.